Well, good morning. Today we are concluding our sermon series from the book of Exodus. We started this series in May of 2024. So in just a little over a year, we've gotten through a really big, big, meaty story. And as we come to these final verses, we're really getting to the heart of what this has all been about. In the very first sermon that I preached from Exodus back in May of last year, I said that the one big story that the Bible is telling is the story of Jesus. And then I also said, if you want to read that big story of Jesus, if you want to read it from the very beginning, then you start with the Exodus. Because the Exodus is the redemptive event that sets everything else in motion. It's the rescue story about the God who saves. It's in the Exodus that God reveals who he is and what he does. It's through the Exodus that God first saves his people, and then he tells them who they are, that they are his chosen, beloved people. Now, the first book in our Bibles, the book of Genesis, it was written by Moses, and it was written for the people of the Exodus. It was to tell them the backstory of how they got to this place and why their God was saving them and taking them to this promised land. It's because of the Exodus. It's because God saves his people that we are then told this larger story of what God is doing. And that larger story points us to Jesus. Exodus sets up this pattern of salvation that is fulfilled in Jesus. It establishes the law, and it introduces a form of worship, all of which were always meant to point us to Jesus. Now, some of you know that I used to be a carpenter, and so when I was a carpenter, one of the things that I learned, I kind of knew this, but I really learned it firsthand, is that the first part of building a house or building any kind of building is setting the foundation. Now, what I didn't know is that as a carpenter, it was my job to do that first bit. Actually, before the masons will come in and pour the concrete and put down the footers and start doing brickwork, carpenters have to come in and actually set the corners and establish the boundaries and set the guidelines that the masons are going to work off of. So as a carpenter, I was the first one on a job. And then once the foundation is set, then carpenters come in and they build the structure of the house, right? They put up walls and frame the roof and install the subfloor and do all these things. But on any building project, there comes a time when the carpenters step away. And there are other trades that have to come in. There are plumbers and electricians and roofers and plasterers. And they come in and they sort of take over the project for a while. And they do this really important work, right? The house doesn't become a house. It doesn't get finished if this work doesn't happen. But then at the end, one of the things that I always loved getting to do as a carpenter is that the carpenters get to come back in and do all the little finishing touches, right? Putting in baseboard and crown molding and door and window casings and even door handles and locks and towel bars in the bathrooms. All these final little bits are done by carpenters. And so one of the things that I really loved about being a carpenter was actually getting to be on a job from the very beginning to the very end. Now, why am I telling you that story? Ian has a huge grin on his face. He knows why I'm telling you this story. It's because over the last several weeks, Ian has stepped into his role as our new minister. Appropriately, he is taking over the primary preaching responsibility for the church. And kind of like those other trades on a building project, Ian has come in and he's done really important and really excellent work to sort of move things forward in this sermon series. But I think it's important to say, if you don't know this, it is not easy to step into the final third of a sermon series that someone else started. And Exodus is a particularly difficult book to come into at the stage where Ian showed up and started preaching. And so after these kind of long descriptive passages that we've been hearing over the last few weeks, these repetition of things that have happened earlier in the story, the verses that we're looking at today, they're kind of the big payoff, right? You you sort of slog through some of these harder bits, and this is the thing that you get to look forward to, right? This is something that I think Ian could quite rightly look forward to getting to preach, and instead, he's given me the opportunity to come and preach it. He's given me the opportunity to kind of do these finishing touches. It is a pastoral kindness to me and to all of us. And so I think it is important, just in the context of this, is to acknowledge the gift that we have in the pastor that the Lord has brought to us. But these verses are a reminder of why we're doing all of this. Why have we read this book of Exodus? Why has God been doing all of these things? They remind us of why we started reading Exodus in the first place. Now, at the beginning of the story in Exodus chapter 2, we read that the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help, and their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And then the next 38 chapters of Exodus are all about how God responds to the cries of his people. They're the story about how God shows up. And all of what God has been doing leads us to what we read right here at the end of chapter 40. Right? So after the cries for help and the plagues and the Red Sea and all of these things, everything is leading to these verses that we're going to look at this morning. And so if you would, please follow along as I read Exodus chapter 40. It's on page 80 in our Pew Bibles. Exodus 40, verses 34 to 38. The glory of the Lord. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. Please pray with me. Father in heaven, we thank you for this morning and for this time that we have together to look at your word. Lord, I pray that you would, by your Spirit, that you would speak to our hearts, that you would give us ears to hear and hearts to believe your promise, your goodness, your gospel truth. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Now, before my family and I moved to London, we lived in Texas, in Houston, Texas. Liz and I lived there together for about 10 years. Finn was born there. The nursery pictures that I showed the kids earlier are from our house in Texas. And one of the things that I learned about while living in Texas is that Texas has a very, very distinctive barbecue culture. Now, I grew up in the Southeast. I grew up around American Southern barbecue. I had tried my hand at making barbecue a few times before we moved to Texas. And it was always a pork shoulder, which is a relatively small, I mean, it's like the size of a football, but when we get to where we're going, it's relatively small and a pretty forgiving piece of meat. You can actually, it's a good thing to learn on because you can make mistakes and it still comes out pretty good. But Texas is all about beef brisket because they raise cattle in Texas, and a beef brisket is huge. Like what they call a packer cut beef brisket is like this big. I mean, it is a massive cut of meat, and it's unforgiving to try to cook it. It's easy to get wrong. It's hard to get right. And a brisket isn't a cut of meat, right? I had a Weber grill, and it wouldn't fit on my Weber grill. If I wanted to learn how to cook this thing that was so much a part of the culture of Texas, like I had to go out and buy an offset smoker, right? And so this is this big barrel that has a firebox on one side. And so you build a fire in there, and then smoke sort of flows through the cooking chamber because it's actually the smoke and not the fire that cooks the barbecue. And so because it's this indirect method of cooking, and because a brisket is a really large cut of meat, then that whole process of cooking a brisket can take about 12 to 16 hours. And so that means if you want to have people over for a barbecue on like midday Saturday, when do you need to start cooking? Right? Like Friday night, Friday afternoon, you've got to plan ahead. That means preparing the brisket, starting the fire in your firebox, making sure that you have enough wood to kind of keep that fire going, getting the airflow just right. There's these baffles that you have to adjust and get everything just right. And then you put the brisket on to cook once the smoker's at the right temperature. And then you just have to keep feeding wood into that firebox and keeping a consistent temperature for about 10 to 12 hours. You have to know exactly when to sort of wrap your brisket in butcher paper so that it doesn't take on too much smoke. It needs enough, but not too much. And then you have to know right when the brisket is cooked, it will have sort of this floppy kind of feel when you pick it up. And you have to know that's when it's ready to come off. And if your smoker's too hot, or if you cook it too long, what you're going to end up with is this big chunk of meat that is tough and dry. And if your temperature's too low and you pull it off too soon, you can end up with this big hunk of meat that is tough and rubbery, right? So you got tough and dry, tough and rubbery, and just right in the middle. And the just right it's a hard target to hit. And so at 4 a.m, sitting alone in the dark, stoking a fire about every 15 minutes, you have a lot of time to ask yourself the question, why am I doing this? I mean, I took a bit of time to explain it to you so that you kind of understand it takes time. And you go, why? Why am I doing this? Why am I putting all of this effort? As I learned to make Texas barbecue, I realized that I did it for 2 reasons. I do enjoy eating barbecue, so that's definitely one reason. I want to learn how to make this thing that I like to eat. But I can't eat a whole brisket. And if all I really want to do is eat barbecue, then it is much easier and it is far cheaper to just go to a restaurant. Right? So then that brings us to the second reason. Why would I spend 12 to 16 hours making barbecue? Because what I really enjoy doing was getting to share what I've made with other people. Right? One brisket will easily feed 15 to 20 people. And so that means once I'm done cooking, I need about that many people to come over to my house and help me eat it. And that's why I wanted to learn how to make barbecue. Because I like to eat it and because I like sharing it with friends and with family. One reason isn't greater than the other. In fact, one reason on its own might not have been enough for me to go through all of that. And so it's really both of those reasons, both of them together, that tell the whole story. That's what we see when God fills the tabernacle. There are 2 key features that we see in what God is doing here. Right? This is the high point of the story of Exodus. Everything has been pointing to this moment. These are the finishing touches, the final details, the last little bits, the reminder of what this whole journey has been about. God has rescued his people so that we might experience his glory and enjoy his presence. That's where everything is pointing to this. God has rescued his people so that we might experience his glory and enjoy his presence. And so the first part of this we see is that God has rescued his people so that we might experience his glory. Verses 34 and 35 are this stunning display of God's glory. What we read here is that this cloud comes and it covers and it completely fills the tabernacle. Now, this is the same glory that covered the top of Mount Sinai. This is the same pillar of cloud and fire that parted the Red Sea, that threw the Egyptians into fear and panic and confusion. This is the glory that reflected off of Moses with such intensity that he had to cover his face. And what we see here is that God's glory so completely filled the tabernacle that Moses couldn't even enter the tent. God filled every bit of that space. God's glory, his holiness, they stand in direct contrast to our own sin and need. Moses can't enter the tent because our sin and God's holiness can't occupy the same space. What we see here is an echo of that very first meeting between God and Moses, when God called out to Moses from the burning bush and he said, "Do not come near. Take the sandals off your feet, because the place where you are standing is holy ground." Right? What does he say? You and I can't occupy the same space. So don't come any closer. God fills the tabernacle with this glory, and then he lays down the ground rules for how we are supposed to approach him. We come to God on his terms because he alone is holy. This filling, this outpouring of God's glory, it shapes how we understand worship. Every week, we begin our church services with a call to worship. Right? This is an invitation from God to come and worship him on his terms. Not because of how we want to worship God, but because how he tells us that he is to be worshiped. We do this because God alone is holy. We do this because God alone is worthy of our worship. Now, as we work through our worship services, we receive these deep assurances of God's love. We receive comfort and mercy. But before we get to any of that, we experience his glory. We behold the glory of God. We approach him on his terms because he alone is holy. God has rescued his people so that we might experience his glory. But God has also rescued his people so that we might enjoy his presence. Everything about this scene also powerfully displays not just God's glory, but that he is near. He's been with his people every step of the way. He heard their cry for rescue. He is the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. He's the God who rescued his people from famine all the way back in Genesis 47 through the work of Joseph. He brought them to safety in Egypt because of Joseph. And yet when we get to Exodus 1, we read, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph." Like there's a Pharaoh, there's a king in Egypt who doesn't know Joseph, doesn't remember who these people are or how they came to be there. But God hadn't forgotten Joseph. God hadn't forgotten his people. Through every single plague, through the Red Sea, through the desert when there was no food and no water, God was near his people. He never left their side. And he will continue to lead them to their promised land. Verse 38 says that the cloud and the fire were in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. I mean, it's such an amazing sort of end to this story because it doesn't really end. Right? Throughout all their journeys, God is with them. You can feel the story continuing on. In other words, God was always near his people, and he always would be. Wherever they went, he was going to be with them. Now, I've said this so many times before, kind of throughout this series, that the rescue that we see in Exodus points ahead to a greater rescue. This is the first part of a larger story that is fulfilled in Jesus. So earlier in the service this morning, we read the transfiguration of Jesus from Luke chapter 9. And that's an event that is just filled with echoes of the Exodus. Jesus is on a mountain, right? He goes to the top of the mountain with Peter, James, and John, and then suddenly he's transformed. And what do his disciples see? They see his glory. Moses and Elijah join them on the mountain, and then this cloud just completely covers them. This is the same cloud that fills the tabernacle, the same cloud of God's glory that Moses couldn't even enter into. This is the cloud that surrounds them on the mountain. And Luke tells us that as they're overshadowed by this cloud, the disciples were afraid. They experience God's holiness, and immediately they understand, they're overwhelmed by their own sin and need, the power of the glory of God. And then God speaks to them. And he says of Jesus, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And so in this moment, we see two things happening on that mountain. That Jesus is holy and that Jesus is near. We see the glory and the presence of Jesus. In Exodus 40, Moses couldn't enter into the cloud of God's holiness, but in Luke 9, Jesus can. The voice of the Father affirms the worthiness of the Son. The glory that appears on that mountain belongs to Jesus. It is his glory. That glory from Exodus 40 and that glory in Luke 9 belong to Jesus. He is, as the writer of Hebrews would say, the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. In other words, Jesus the Son and God the Father are one and the same, and they radiate the same glory. Exodus 40 ends by saying that God is with his people throughout all their journeys. And Matthew 28, the story about Jesus, it expands on that promise, and it says, Jesus says, "Behold, I am with you always, to the very end of the age." Jesus fulfills what the tabernacle promised, that God rescues his people so they might experience his glory and enjoy his presence. God's glory and presence are the theme of the tabernacle. These verses are a picture of God moving into the place that has been built and prepared for him. Even after everything goes wrong with the golden calf. Right, back in Exodus 32, God's people, they blow it. They blow it pretty significantly. And yet God renews his covenant with them just 2 chapters later. In Exodus 34, he renews his covenant. And then after that, God goes right back to giving instructions to his people for how they are to worship him. And so then this includes a repetition of all these instructions for building the tabernacle. And that can feel tedious to us when we read this again in the story, when we preach through it again in a sermon series. And yet there's a key difference to this repetition. Because this time, God's people obey. They listen to God. They follow his instructions. They do it to the letter. They build everything exactly the way he tells them to. And so now, at the end of the Exodus story, we see the glory and the presence of God settle with his people. Now, back in the late 1980s, there was a movie called Field of Dreams. And it's a movie about a corn farmer in Iowa who hears this voice that keeps telling him, if you build it, he will come. And he believes that this voice is telling him to build a baseball diamond in the middle of his cornfield. And so that's what he does. Now, the rest of the movie relies on a particular event in the history of American baseball to then tell a deeper story about family and relationships. But don't worry, you don't need to know anything about baseball to get the point of why I'm bringing up Field of Dreams. Because what drives the plot of this movie is an examination of faith. What is faith? What does it look like? How does it work? The movie presents faith as something mysterious and uncertain, something really largely unknown. But more importantly, it presents faith as a risk-reward type of relationship. If this farmer risks his livelihood and tears up his corn and builds a baseball field right in the middle of it, he will come. If you build it, he will come. The farmer doesn't even know who he is, right? He doesn't even know who's being promised, and yet he listens to this voice. He decides to take this great risk in order to receive some kind of reward. And, it's an uplifting movie, so he receives the reward he's looking for, not in the way he expected, but he gets this reward, even though he doesn't know what it is. He has faith, and because he believes, he receives the reward. Now, it might be really easy to see a parallel between Field of Dreams and the tabernacle. If you build it, he will come. Build this tabernacle, and the Lord will come. He'll move in. He'll be with you forever. But is that what happens in the Exodus? Does God show up because the people have built a tent for him? Is God's glory and his presence, is that the reward for their faith? So earlier in the children's lesson, we talked about setting up a nursery for a new baby. When a couple is expecting a baby, they usually need to transform some room in their house. What used to be a guest room or a home office has to be made into a nursery. And the old furniture is taken out, and new paint or new wallpaper is put up on the walls, and baby furniture is brought into the room, and a crib and a changing table and maybe a rocking chair and toys and books and all of these things that are going to make it just right for the baby. And then finally, the day comes when the parents get to bring their baby home. And the baby moves into this room that's been prepared for them. They built it. And he or she has come. But as I asked the children, is building the nursery the reason that they have a baby? No, of course not. Building the nursery isn't the reason for the baby, it's the response. The couple doesn't set up a nursery in their house in order to bring about some kind of reward. They do it because something wonderful has already happened. The nursery is the response to finding out that they're having a baby. That's what we see with the tabernacle. God's people don't build the tabernacle so that God will come and be with them. They build it because he is already with them. Faith isn't about risk and reward. Faith is our response to what God has done. See, Field of Dreams sort of invites us to have kind of this blind faith. Faith in something and hope that something good will happen. God doesn't call us to a blind faith. He calls us to believe in what we can see and know. He calls us to believe in what he has done. And so God's people here have finally been obedient to his word. They finally obeyed his commands. They've built the tabernacle. And yes, they received blessings because of their obedience. When God fills the tabernacle with his glory and his presence, there is a visible and a tangible certainty that God is indeed with his people. But God isn't with them because they've built the tabernacle. They've built the tabernacle because God is with them. And that's the great conclusion to this whole story about the God who saves. Exodus begins with this people who feel forgotten, but it ends with the people who are known and who are called by name. It begins with slaves who are building cities for a cruel and wicked king. But it ends with worshipers who are building a house for the living God, for the King of all kings. It begins with attention and with uncertainty. It ends with resolution and with promise. This story that keeps going. What is promised in the tabernacle is fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus, the perfect sacrifice. Jesus, who is God with us now and always. And he is every bit as real as the tabernacle. The tabernacle with its curtains and its poles, these things that could be seen and touched and held in your hands. The living God is with us, and he's working among us by the victory of Christ and by the power of his Spirit in a way that is every bit as real and tangible. The God who spoke from the burning bush, the one who sent plagues against Egypt, the one who parted the Red Sea, the God who fed his people in the desert when there was no food and there was no water, the one who brought water from a rock, the God who spoke his law and renewed his promise even when his people failed. That same God is with us right here in this place. He speaks to us by his word. He comforts us by his Spirit. He transforms our lives by his mercy and his love. And so these verses aren't the end of the story. They are merely the end of the beginning. Right? This is the event that sets everything else in motion. The God of the Exodus is still guiding his people. He is still present with us wherever we go. And so as we come to the Lord's table this morning, in the same way that the tabernacle was tangible and physical and real, we come to the Lord's table, to these signs and seals of what Jesus has done that are tangible and physical and real. We can taste and see that God is good. We can hold in our hands these signs and seals of his promise to save. Because God rescues his people so that we might experience his glory and enjoy his presence. And to do this, to do those things, to experience his glory and to enjoy his presence, he gives us Jesus. Please pray with me.